Okay, it is now 2 o'clock, and so I resume the hearing. In a moment I'm going to look to the council and give them the opportunity to reply to the number of things that we've just heard around the table. Before I do that, sort of looking beyond the council's response, I'm slightly concerned about the progress that we're making, and I do want to make some progress now. We have, as I say, strayed slightly from my carefully laid plan of how the debate would go today. It seems to me that we've covered quite a lot of ground in terms of the 2016 versus 2014 versus other things as the starting point. I'm hard-pressed to believe that there can be much more, if anything, left to say about that. We have as well heard quite a lot and covered quite a lot of ground in relation to the economic-based model, and I'm also rather hopeful that there's not a great deal left to say about that. I do at some point, quite soon though, want to take, feels like a step back, but I don't think it is, to talk about the market signals and uplifts, etc., in relation to the demographic figure that the council has arrived at. And as well, and don't let me forget this, as I mentioned early this morning, I also want to have a look at the mixing and matching issue as well. Does that seem like, well, a sensible way forward? Are there any violent objections? Very good. Okay, thank you. In which case then, first of all, sorry, there is a violent objection.
Thank you, sir. It's not a violent objection.
Good.
But I can't stay for the whole afternoon. I'm just wondering when you thought we might get to the affordable housing issue and housing numbers.
Yeah, are you talking about things like uplift for affordability and that kind of thing? Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I very much want to press on to. First of all, though, we'll hear the council's reply to what we heard just before lunch.
Thank you.
Okay, firstly, I was going to come back on the issue raised, I think it was Mr. Lane, in regarding to Greenbelt permanence, and specifically in relation to the early review of the plan. The plan has identified land to meet longer-term development needs to 2038, which is 5 years beyond the plan period in order to create Greenbelt permanence. Several of the larger strategic sites have build-out periods beyond the plan period which meet longer-term development needs as required.
Sorry, could I?
Sorry.
Forgive me. Can I hold you there and ask you to just hold that thought until we move on to question 2.5?
Yep. Okay. Yes, I'll deal with it then.
Just in response to Mr. Pollard's point about student growth, in essence, the projections, any projections, take into account any change in the student population over a period of time. It just so happens that the 2016 base projections are fed into a 5 or 6 year trend, depending on what element of the population projections you're looking at. It just so happens that it coincides with quite a period of strong growth in the student population. I would...
Sorry, Mr. McCall, are you saying that the 2016 population projections?
Yes, and subsequently the household projections.
Yeah, okay, include quite a strong element of growth in the student population?
Well, the projections themselves are don't make any comment on economic activity of the population going forward. However, the period from which they are drawn, 2010 to 2016, include quite a strong period of growth at the universities. Therefore, we can make the assumption that going forward, some of those trends will be projected forward as well. Just to give you an indication of the scale of that growth, Mr. Keogh, in his representation, SID 849, on page 12 of that, paragraph 2.8, he sets out that student numbers between 2009 and 2017 increased from 12,710 to 16,474, a difference of around 3,764 or 4% per annum. So there's quite a considerable growth in the student numbers within the input period to the population projections. I can further align that specifically to full-time students over the 2010 to 2015-16 period, which the population projections draw on. And over that period, we saw a growth of around, and apologies, my computer's just frozen, but it was a growth of around 5,000 full-time students over that period. Sorry, my apologies. My computer's just having a bit of a hissy fit at this moment in time. In actual fact, what it showed is that there was a growth of 1,905 students over the last 6 years, feeding into the population projections, and taking that forward over the next 16 years would equate to around 5,080 people.
So is your overarching point then, Mr. McColgan, that the growth in student numbers, as you see it, is accounted for?
Yes.
On the issue of completions, we will leave that until the stage when you were going to deal with completions. And on the statement made just before lunch that we're going to see something that we've yet to see from the university, then we'll reserve comment until we've seen it. And on the affordability issue, we'll deal with that at the appropriate stage later on this afternoon.
I see that some are indicating to come in. Are these sort of, final comments on the points that we've been talking about before we move, as I say, a slight shuffle back towards market signals and uplifts for affordability and that type of thing? Yeah.
I'd like to make some general points, if I may.
Is it Mr. Carr?
Barclay.
Is it Mr. Carr?
It is indeed. If I may, yes, they're not particularly relevant to the fine figures we've just been listening to, but there are some pertinent points I'd like to make. I'm a city councillor representing a large village ward in the York Green Belt, and I would like to make some general points about what we've heard this morning. We've heard a lot of technical argument from the many house building and commercial interests here today about the level of housing need in York. I won't get involved in the finer points of that, but there does seem to me to be a clear and marked downward trend in the forecasts for York, and this trend does appear to be well established. I don't need to say that York is a unique and highly attractive city. You could double the size of the city and it still wouldn't satisfy the latent demand to live here. And I doubt it would have much impact on affordability either. As a councillor involved in the preparation of this local plan, I consider it sound at 790 DPA. If, sir, you are inclined to question its soundness, I would say this. In light of all the recent evidence, there is growing risk that the York local plan housing figures are overgenerous and the housing need is exaggerated. If the future population and housing figures in the York local plan are overestimated, there is a real danger that too much land will be allocated for housing development. And the result of that over-allocation would be that the easy sites, the greenbelt and greenfield sites, especially in infill locations, will be picked off first. And the more difficult to develop sites, those on brownfield and or those requiring heavy upfront infrastructure investment, will be left to languish. This in turn would have an adverse impact on those reuse and regeneration projects in York, notably York Central, which are so vital to the future economic, social and environmental well-being of this city, as well as doing irreparable harm to the unique character and setting of this world-famous city. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Mr. Robinson.
Thanks, sir. I'd just like to quickly respond to the points raised by Mr. Colgan about the student population and the extent to which he believes they are factored into the 2016 population projections. We produced a whole chapter on this in my proposed representations on the housing matters. So if you have that to hand, it's really section 5. But the pertinent points are particularly, we looked at the 2016 base projections and we pulled out the past and projected population growth in York for residents aged 18 to 23, which is reasonable. It'll be the bulk, not the entirety, but the bulk of those attending the universities here. And what you can see from figure 6 in our representations is that there's been virtually no growth. In fact, there was a dip from about 2014 to 2025 in the 2016-based SMPP. So virtually no growth up to that point. And that's particularly pertinent given that the universities we looked at in a bit of detail, York St John in particular, said that they were going to, their growth was up to 2026. The next figure, 7, we pulled out the communal establishment population in York for residents aged 18 to 23. So people based, you would imagine the bulk of that, apart from prisons, is going to be in student accommodation. And what that very clearly shows, that there's absolutely no growth between 2013 and the entirety of the projection period under the 2016 population projections. So basically it's just a straight line for those years. So clearly there's no incremental growth that's been factored in for the C2 student accommodation, and we would say very limited for the C3 for all residents aged 18 to 23. So that's just the baseline population projections. We then set alongside the evidence produced by O'Neill's and by the universities themselves about the very high level of student growth forecast they're going to factor in. Obviously, we haven't seen a statement of common ground yet, but the figures are in the public domain. I understand they've been modelling 2% per annum student growth for the University of York, and I direct you to the discussion we put out in paragraphs 5.14 to 5.19 in my appendix. In addition, University of York St John is looking at boosting student numbers to 10,000 by 2026, and that's in their 2026 strategy document, 2019. And that's a growth of 3,750 students from 2017-18 over an 8-year period. Just extremely high level of growth. Now, we've then looked at a variety of methods as to what that might mean in terms of the housing need. And to be fair, we tried to follow a fairly similar approach that GL Hearn followed in Guildford, where they ended up adding 26 dwellings per annum on top of the OAN to address those student numbers. And in our table 10, we've looked at the amount of student growth, the proportion likely to live in PRS, so the private rented sector, and the amount of students per house. We've assumed 4 per house in a similar way to GL Hearn. And that equates to an additional 1,346 dwellings needed, working out at about 84 dwellings per annum over 16 years, which we believe isn't fully taken into account in the baseline population projections. Thank you.
Mr. Carr?
I'm sorry, sir, yeah, okay.
Mr. Keogh?
Yes, so just for clarification, in response to Mr. McColgan, the figures I gave earlier related to employment growth. They weren't actually for input into the, I wasn't raising any issues in respect of the student component of the population or housing growth. It was purely on the economic side. While my mic is on, sir, can I just again quiz you as to how you're going to treat the issue of completions and shortfall? I mean, there is a question in relation to affordable housing. You do raise the issue of shortfall in, I think it's 2.3E. When you say you're going to deal with shortfall and completions in phase 2, I'm just curious as to how that feeds into the overall housing requirement figure that we're talking about now.
Yeah, and I think perhaps we were talking at cross purposes earlier, but yeah, it's a 2.3F, which I'm attempting to chivvy us towards. Mr. Pavlovich.
Thank you. Just on the point relating to the student numbers, you've just heard about the St John's University, but I'm really confused. There was a presentation to main planning when Campus East was being developed, where they identified their projected growth over the next 5 years as being 22,000 students. So I'm confused as to where you've got the overall figure from. If you're taking the university's own economic development plan into account.
Is that something the council can shed any light on?
We were just reporting the student growth numbers that are in the public domain. So the work on University of York was from the O'Neill Associates submissions, and the growth in the University of York St John is their 2026 strategy document 2019, which is available on the internet, and that sets out their ambition to grow to 10,000 students by 2026. I'm not sure where the 22,000 figures come from, whether that's part of the University of York figures. The 22,000, okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to move into an area where we're cross-examining, and particularly with the microphone off. I didn't catch what you said then, Mr. Pavlovich.
Sorry, I said, yes, that was the University of York figures, not the St John's figures.
If we all look carefully at the matters, issues and questions paper, it seems to me that we have covered 2.3a, 2.3c and d, and because it's a general catch-all sort of question, we've probably covered E, apart from we haven't talked about affordability and market signals and the like. Does that seem about right? Mr. Corsia.
So we still have to deal with the inherited shortfall as well.
I'll tell you what, I'll take that now. Let's deal with that now.
So can we just leave that for 2 minutes, because I haven't got the papers in front of me. I wasn't expecting you to take it that moment. Give me 5 minutes to just...
Be careful of what you ask for, Mr. Corsia.
I was saying it was still an item to be dealt with. I assumed you were going to deal with it after you dealt with market trends, because that seems to be, to me, more sensible. So.
Okay then, in terms of, well, let's deal with question 2.3b, and that's the Council's chance to tell us about the market signals and other uplifts that have been applied to the demographic figure.
Okay, I think that'll fall on me initially. In terms of market signals, this is set out in Planning Practice Guidance, paragraphs 2A019 and 2A020, and also within the Housing Needs Update CYC 9 in section 3 or 4, section 4 I think. Section 4 from page 19 of that document. I don't...
Sorry, is that the OAN update?
So yes,
the
2019.
OAN update.
So EXCYC 9.
Yeah, frankly, I struggle with all these document reference numbers. I can't for the life of me remember them. But by document name, I sort of know what I'm looking at. So,
Housing Needs Update, January 2019. Yes. And market signals there are dealt with, it said section 4 from page 19. I think rather than going through that report, just highlighting the PPG sets out a range of market signals that can be considered. House prices, rents, affordability, other contextual information such as overcrowding. And the advice given within the practice guidance in paragraph 2A020, is around uplifts that should be applied. But going back to the previous paragraph, I think this is probably an important point, and it did actually come up just before lunch. How should market signals be taken into account? The housing need number suggested by household projections, brackets, the starting point, should be adjusted to reflect appropriate market signals. And that's important because the establishing of this starting point is therefore pretty crucial. If we go back to other paragraphs that we've been through today, it's quite clear that the starting point in terms of this guidance is the latest official household projections as published. And I think...
Yeah, I don't want to go back to the question of the starting
it's quite an important point. Because rather than going through all the market signals, we have concluded implications of market signals, paragraph 429 to 431 of that housing needs update, which does recognise that there are certainly affordability issues in York that would warrant an uplift from that starting point. I don't think anyone's around the table is necessarily suggesting that's not the case.
So we're clear, you're talking, I think, Mr. Gardner, aren't you? Correct me if I'm wrong, about affordability rather than affordable housing. You're talking about affordability within the market, private market sectors.
Initially, yes. Yes. And the suggestion of the housing need update is that an uplift from the starting point projection of around 15% would be appropriate on the basis of the evidence in there. And that's really...
Forgive me, I didn't catch that.
The suggestion within the housing need update, paragraph 4.34, is that on the basis of the evidence around affordability and other market signals, that an uplift from that starting point projection of around about 15% would be considered reasonable.
You think you know what I'm going to ask you? Why?
Because almost tracking what particularly inspectors had viewed around market signals over time. The first couple of reports were in East Lea and Uttlesford, where the inspector, I think was a different inspector in each case, suggested that local authorities should think about adding 10% onto their figures. And then over time, some of those uplifts got a bit higher. In Waverley, the inspector applied a 25% uplift. Mid-Sussex, 20%, Canterbury, 20%. And although affordability issues in York are quite severe, they are not as severe as places such as Waverley, which is a rather pricey area of Surrey, as you'd be aware. So it was a balanced judgment that around 15% would be an appropriate uplift on the basis of that evidence, and that uplift should be applied to that start point figure, which we derived earlier in this report as being 484 dwellings per annum, linked to the latest household projections. So that was a figure that was household growth plus a vacancy allowance. We've added on a vacancy allowance because that seems to have been the way, again, having gone through the Guildford local plan, the inspector there was content that the start point was those projections, but he felt that adding on a vacancy allowance to get to his start point was the position he wanted to take.
Just remind me, what's the vacancy allowance here?
3%, which is just a fairly standard figure. We actually did look at...
What does that mean?
So it means that we're suggesting that there would need to be an extra 3% of homes on top of the household growth to take account of the fact that there will always be some vacant properties as household move between different properties.
Yeah, what I actually meant was, what do you mean by, when you say 3% is a standard figure? What does a standard figure mean?
As in a figure that we would typically apply. In the past, we've looked at census data about vacancy rates. They're quite out of date. We've also looked at council tax data about vacancy rates. They can often underestimate vacancies because people don't register homes as being vacant anymore in the same sort of level because there's no discounts. And generally, I think a 3% is considered to be a typical sort of level that allows for sort of frictional movement within the housing stock. The choice of alternative figures would be around that sort of mark, and it wouldn't make a huge difference to the numbers.
Okay, so you've looked at a 3%, well, you've looked at an uplift, if I can put it that way, I think that's probably the right way to put it, as a vacancy allowance, plus a 15% uplift, and that's all about affordability, is it? Just so I'm clear, the 15%?
That's right, yes.
Okay, are there any other market signals of relevance here in your view?
Well, I think having added the 15% onto the 484, that's derived a market signals-based OAN of 557 dwellings per annum, and you can find that set out in paragraph 4.34. And then the following paragraph notes that with the economic growth estimated housing need being 790, and that being somewhat higher than that market signals figure, the higher of the figures should be taken forward as the OAN, the 790 rather than the 557. And I think the other issues around affordable housing, the 790 figure is 63% above that start point, and it's considered within this report that that would be quite a significant additional amount of housing that would also provide additional affordable housing to meet the affordable need.
And it's right, is it, that the uplifts should be applied in relation, well, in the way that you've done it, in relation to the starting point for the demographic figure, but is not something that should be added in relation to the economically derived figure?
No, I think that the purpose of a market signals uplift, as I understand it, is twofold really. One is around enabling additional households to form that perhaps wouldn't have previously been able to, and also potentially to allow for additional population to move to an area where they may have been previously excluded from the market. And when we get to the 790 figure, that does include both an uplift to the household formation that we discussed earlier, but also there is an uplift of population growth to ensure there's sufficient labour supply to fill the jobs. So that once you've done that, if you were to add anything further on top of that, there would be a clear double count.
So from your perspective, Mr. Garner, does what you've just explained to us tell the whole story in terms of uplifts and affordability? It's that simple.
I would say so. In terms of what I was saying about the uplift, there's two purposes for those market signals uplifts. That's not set out specifically in guidance, but that's how I'm reading it. Actually, it is set out in guidance sitting behind the new NPPF. So it's clearly that's where market signals are. The uplift is considered to be relevant for that. So I think as long as within this work, it's quite clear that you have addressed those two issues, then yes, it is a reasonable uplift, and taking into account that the uplift from that starting point is 63%, that is substantial. And if we look back at local plans where the OAN has actually been derived from simply taking a start point and then adding on a figure, there is nowhere that's added on that sort of level of growth. The highest you're sort of seeing is probably about 30% in places like Cambridge. I think Canterbury maybe as well.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points on that. And the first point, that you don't apply the market signals uplift to anything apart from the starting point of the house projections. The logic in that is totally flawed. I mean, GL Hearn in their table 6, where they've looked at modelling a variety of household growth scenarios. 484, okay, that's the output DPA based on the 2016 household projections. But they then, as we've heard earlier, have modelled a part return to trend, which comes up with 679 dwellings per annum. And we heard earlier that the logic behind that was to correct what were considered to be flaws in household formation rates in the 2016 household projections, because they're just based on it up to 2001 to 2016 rather than the 1971, the 40 years trends that the previous ones did. So GL Hearn validated that, and quite rightly, I have to say, by providing an accelerated household formation scenario, which they applied to the baseline demographics. They also applied that to the employment-led one as well, of course, and that's actually underpinned the 790 dwellings per annum. So quite correctly, GL Hearn is saying, well, we accept that there should be some adjustment to household formation rates because they're doing that with the economic-led scenario. They've also done that to the demographic scenario. I don't see why, when they're correcting what they consider to be flaws in the baseline projections, you wouldn't then apply the 15% uplift to the 679 figure, and why they're only applying it to 484. Because by doing it to 484, they're saying, well, it's lower than 679, therefore there's no need for a market uplift. That's got to be wrong, because if you look at any of the market signals, I'm sure my colleagues will go into this in a lot of depth, all the market signals are pointing to the fact that York has got a severe degree of stress in the market. It's got the highest affordability ratios in Northern England. It's got rocketing house prices. The fact that the GL Hearn is saying, well, we'll just keep going along without any further uplift on the demographic side just makes no sense. So that was one point I wanted to do. The second point, we just be careful that the market signals don't include any affordable housing uplift, right? Clearly, which paragraph is it? Paragraph 19 of the PPG.
Just to be clear, are you making a distinction there between an uplift for affordability and an uplift for affordable housing?
That's absolutely right. So if you look at the six adjustments, or the six market signals should be taken into account. You've got land prices, house prices, rents, affordability, but that's the affordability ratio and not affordable housing. You've then got the rate of development and overcrowding, and that's set out in paragraph 2A019. None of those are affordable housing. So that's one point. The third point I would say is the errors in the council's data. So if you look at their table, just bear me a second, sorry. Had it open a moment ago. Table 12 of their housing needs assessment, where they compare the median and lower quartile affordability ratios. I went through this, and 3 of the columns are completely wrong. We all make mistakes, and but just they've got the figures wrong. So the figures for lower quartile 2017, they've got them the wrong way around. So the figure for York isn't 7.26, it's 9.11. So the figure for England should actually be the figure for York, and vice versa.
I did notice that is something that stuck out in your evidence. This is a matter of, this should ought to be something that is a matter of fact. Are the numbers right or wrong?
Well, without having the numbers in front of me, we can accept that even at 9.11, the adjustment itself wouldn't get us to a point where the OEN would change. The reason for that is, as Mr. Gardner set out, there is a range, a 15% uplift has been applied, but there is quite a substantial difference between that and the number we get to in the OEN. Therefore, accepting that is an error, it wouldn't impact the OEN.
Well, coming back on that, I'm sure they can check it, but Table 4 of my proof actually provides the updated 2018 version.
Yeah, I would like the council to double check that and confirm to me one way or the other what the situation is.
Okay, so just quickly finish up, let us speak. Table 4 in my submission updates it for the latest 2018 figure, which, to be fair to GL Hearn, came out after they'd done it, but it kind of emphasised the fact that City of York lower quartile affordability ratio is 9.41. Now I think is the highest in Northern England. You compare that to the Yorkshire and Humber, which is 5.8. Compare that with Selby, which is 7.44, and England, which is 7.29. And that increased by 20% over the last 5 years. So if GL Hearn were making judgments on data that they'd inaccurately put in there. I've got concerns about the validity of the 50% uplift figure. But we can see that the situation is terrible for the City of York, it's unacceptable, and it's getting worse. And my final point is whether 15% is a reasonable uplift. Well, we're suggesting 20%. I've provided a range of justifications for that. It could be even higher, to be perfectly honest. But setting it in the context of Jill Hearn's own evidence, they uplifted Selby by 17%, even though the market, I don't think anyone here would say that the housing market is as strong in Selby as it is in York, and York has a lower uplift. And a further benchmark that's open to everybody is that if you look at the standard methodology, the uplift on that will be 30% for the City of York. So just a couple of benchmarks that just demonstrate to us that 15% is totally insufficient. Thank you.
Mr. Pavlovich.
Thank you, sir. I do need to leave, so I did want to have the opportunity just to make some observations. I found today incredibly interesting, very technical and a bit over my head, a lot of it. I've spent my career working with the homeless and the most vulnerable in our society, and as of August this year, we had 1,470 people on the housing waiting list, 120 of which were in priority need. These are families and individuals that are desperate for a place to live and a place that they can afford to live, and that is not being delivered in York at the moment, and I don't think that this plan will address that. We've also got a high employment but low wage economy, and we've got so many people that are working in shops and hotels that can't afford to form a household because they can't afford to live here. That's one of the reasons why household formation, in my opinion, is delayed, because they can't afford to move out of the family home. And we have key workers, and I meet them every day, that say, well, I live in Pocklington, I live in Selby. We've heard today how many of the people around this table actually that live in York. If we can't deliver affordable housing to our key workers, our infrastructure, our employees, where will the city end up? And it will stagnate, and it will retrench, and it will not be the vibrant city that people want to live in, because it will be affordable only to those individuals that can afford to pay full market price. And yes, the private sector will deliver the vast bulk of this, but there was very little in this local plan that I felt addressed the needs of those low-paid workers and the homeless and the vulnerable in the city. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that, Councillor Pavlovich. Can I just check, Councillor Pavlovich, is that everything that you want? Everything that you wanted to say? I know that you're pressed for time and need to leave.
Yes, thank you very much for letting me make that submission.
You're welcome. Mr. Natcris.
Thank you. It's just on the 15% point. as well, which we've made in our representations, that we think that this should be higher. Just a few statistics that are in our reps. I think it's prudent just to highlight in terms of the current affordability ratios and the increases that have happened to them. So the lower and median affordability ratios have increased by 134% and 139% since 1997 in York. Now that's higher than any neighbouring authority, which includes Selby, which we've just heard has a 17% uplift, and it's way above the regional averages, which are 87% and 91%, so almost 40% higher than regional on both of those, and indeed also the national averages. And the national averages for the lower quartile are 104% increase as opposed to York's 134, and for the medium quartile it's 124% increase. So it shows that as of 2018, the lower quartile ratio in York is 62% higher than the regional average and 30% higher than the national average. It shows the extent of what's happened in York and what is continuing to happen if intervention doesn't occur. And I think when you ask the questions to the council, how did they get to the 15? There didn't seem to be any evidence behind it. It was almost, well, a few inspectors had gone with around 10, 15, and while some places had gone high, they were down south, so we wouldn't possibly go that up here. But everything's relevant in terms of where we are, in terms of affordability. People in Leafy Surrey, I think it was referred to, probably earn a lot more than many people in Leafy York. So in terms of that ratio, it is all relevant, and I think where 2025 is being applied elsewhere, because of the stark contrast between York and the neighbouring authorities and the rest of the region as a whole, we do need to look at a step change in that, and I think 2025 is where we should be getting to. And to reiterate the point that it's in our reps, if you go and look at standard methodology, that is at 30%. So even that wouldn't be a step too far if we were looking at that as a step change.
Mr. Gomez.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. My others in the room have covered points I wanted to make about the severity of the worsening of York's position relative to others in Yorkshire. My first point is to pick up the part of the rationale that Mr. McColgan gave for settling on 15%, and that was having looked at places down south, Canterbury, Waverley and mid-Sussex, inspectors had gone for higher percentage uplifts, and the implication was York's not quite that bad, and therefore 15% is the appropriate figure. We've looked at the rate of worsening on the median affordability ratio, and York is actually, over the period since 2013, York is actually on par in terms of, or worse than, in terms of the rate of worsening than those three areas by my reckoning. That points to us to an uplift of at least 20% and possibly higher being considered. I concur with Mr. Robinson's point that the new method, which indicates an uplift of 30% for York, is not at all unreasonable. The purpose of those uplifts in the new standard method is explicitly to address affordability problems. There is logic and, one would say, from the point of view of the government's advisors, Treasury and so on, presumably some science behind that. My second point is how the uplift should be applied. Mr. Gardner described the purpose of the market signals uplift as being to allow new households to form and to allow additional migration. I accept that additional household formation would be a consequence of increasing the supply relative to demand. I don't see where in the PPG it mentions either of those points, and it's house building, the housing numbers, that is there to deal with migration, and indeed the 790 DPA figure for related to employment growth is the amount of housing that the council assumes is required to absorb the additional working people needed to service York's future economic growth. Now, my reading of the planning practice guidance is that the objective of the market signals uplift is to address supply relative to demand. You change supply relative to demand in a way that could be reasonably expected to improve affordability. So it's that balance of demand and supply. If you are planning and building housing at a level that you expect is required to meet future demand from workers, you are simply planning a level that is consistent with that demand. You are not explicitly factoring an increase in the supply over that level of demand, which might be expected to improve affordability. So my argument is that you should be applying an uplift to your jobs-led figure, because all you're doing if you build at 790 is meeting future demand. You're not doing anything to address the demand-supply balance. So any market signals uplift should be logically applied to that jobs-led figure. My final point is just to reiterate Mr. Robinson's point about Selby, because I think it is a significant one. It takes us back to the mix and match issue that you raised this morning. We have, as I understand it from my reading of GL Hearn's work on Selby, 17% being the appropriate figure for Selby, but we have 15% in York for an area that I think we accept is one of the least affordable in Northern England, and is seeing affordability worsen at a faster rate than or an equivalent rate to high-priced areas in the south of England.
Mr. Austin Fell.
Thank you, sir. It's really just to kind of build on the points made there by Mr. Gomez. And what we've seen in the evolution of the plan is we've moved from an OAN, which has been informed in part by market signals as part of the 2017 SHMAR. Ultimately, the executive officers at the council did not accept this adjustment, hence we were just left with the projections, but that is what informed the plan at that time. We're now at a stage where we're looking at an economic-led plan, and that derives the figure of 790 dwellings. And I agree with all the things that have been said around the table by sort of colleagues that market signals in York are worsening, they are severe, and they do warrant an uplift. But the concern I have is that it doesn't really matter whether it's 15%, 20, or even 30%. It's going to have very little bearing on an uplift to the overall OAN. So in this context, it becomes a bit of an academic exercise as to whether or not a different proportionate uplift should be made. And if you're going to eject me here.
Yes. Well, an academic exercise, yes, but, well, you might say, but nonetheless one that I need to undertake.
Quite so. And coming around to the point here and echoing Mr. Gomez's comments, it's whether or not there's justification in this instance to look beyond the economic OAN in order to make a further adjustment to address imbalances in supply and demand. Now, the PPG tells us that the market signals uplift should be made to the starting point, and as we know, if you were minded to go with the 2016 starting point, that would be informed from a diminished position from 2014. But we know that the council has submitted a plan on the basis of a higher OAN already, the 867. And it's whether, sir, there is a logic here, knowing that they considered that figure to be sound in the past, to see whether or not there's any adjustments that could be made beyond the 790, which could capture both affordability and the topic we're going to come on to next, sir, which is affordable housing, in order to address those wider shortfalls. Thank you.
Mrs. Cook.
Thank you very much, sir. Agree with Mr. Robinson and Mr. Gomez in particular. Can I just take you back to IDA paragraph 20, and in particular to the second paragraph, which refers to the more significant the affordability constraints as reflected in rising prices, rents and worsening affordability ratio, and the stronger the other indicators of high demand, i.e. the differential between land prices, the larger the improvement in affordability needed. So I make that point, give you that reference. And secondly, sir, in our matter paper for today, at Appendix 3, we have a series of tables. And I would draw your attention to what they are indicating, both in relation to York and indeed Selby. So the first one is looking at house prices, and it's looking at the period 2010 to 2018, and top of the league, first past the post, 35.8% is York in terms of house price increases in that period. That's to be compared with 26.6% in Selby. Earnings, York, and again, so in these tables you will also be able to see how we fare, the York position fares in relation to both the other areas in this part of the country as well as England. And so you can see when it comes to earnings that, again, York, as between 2010 and 2018, there has been only an 8.9% increase in earnings compared to if I give you a higher, the figure for England, it's a 13.7% increase. So it is indeed true that those in Kent, Surrey and Mid-Sussex are, on the evidence, paid more, relatively speaking, than those who live in York. And the affordability ratio is given, again, York tops the table at 8.86%. Sorry, it's 24.6%. It's a factor of 8.86 in 2018. Quite right. It's a 24.6%. So these figures really do, in my submission, demonstrate, particularly when you factor in Selby, that the 15% is an inadequate uplift. And I think one of the most shocking things that I have read is this. In 2011, 59%, and this is 3.29.6 of my matter paper on today. In 2011, 59% of all house sales in York were between 100,000 and 200,000. And this has fallen to, by 2018, 33% of sales, house sales, and in 2019, 22%. So we've gone from 2011 to 2019, a very staggering difference in the average house sale prices in York. And I think in your opening questions to GL Hearn, you asked, by reference to their housing needs update, whether paragraphs 4.29 onwards really tells the whole story in terms of uplifts. And it doesn't in my submission, because actually it's not telling you anything really in there about York. All it's telling you about is what happened in Waverley, Mid-Sussex and Canterbury. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Barnes.
Sorry if I'm repeating a point that Mr. Robinson's made. It's probably my understanding of it rather than anything, but I don't quite understand how they can conclude a 15% uplift. It was reasonable to market signals when the uplift made in response only for new household formation is much higher, at 40%, and that doesn't address people who are stuck in rented accommodation, people who shared ownership, all of that. People who commute into York who can't afford to live here.
Anything else at all on this side of the table before I go to the council for their final reply on the question of uplifts? Very good.
I will accept Mr. Robinson's assertion that those numbers were flipped between the York figure and the England figure. So the council figure for York that I have, the lower quartile figure for York that the most recently published data suggests is at 9.06 is the ratio, rather than the 911, but it might be just a difference in the versions. So we accept that. However, what needs to be said is that this has to be put in the context of the wider uplifts. So the guidance suggests that, as we've established, it should be on those baseline projections, the household projections as published. It doesn't stipulate what that uplift should be, only that it should be reasonable and on the basis of the evidence in front of us. The evidence that we had was a number of inspectors who'd chosen to make 10%, 15%, 20% uplifts throughout the country. We benchmarked those areas, as have been mentioned, Canterbury, Waverley and Mid-Sussex, all of which had a significantly higher affordability ratio. On that measure, we decided that in York, bearing in mind that these are all relative measures, relative house prices to relative earnings, regardless of whether someone in Surrey is earning more than someone in York, everything is relative with this calculation. It was therefore we decided it wasn't justified to go to 20% and that 15% was reasonable. A number of other figures have been bandied around, for example the 17% in Selby. Now,
yes, that was the one I wanted to ask you specifically about.
That is the standard method uplift. So it's the 17%, as the 30% in York is the uplift under the standard method here. The 17% is the standard method being used in Selby. I think what Mr. Austin Fell was getting at was that these are largely academic, because we could have made these uplifts. We could have had 15, 20, 17, 30%, even 63% uplifts for market signals, and we would only get to the position where we are with the economic-led need. Now that was something which the inspector in Guildford looked into in terms of, well, should a further adjustment for affordability on top of the jobs growth and student growth, is that required in Guildford? Well, he determined that the 79% uplift that we applied in Guildford was significantly above the starting point that it can be expected to improve affordability and will also boost the supply of housing in accordance with the policy. So it's a bit of a red herring about these comparator areas, because the economic uplift, as agreed with the inspector at Guildford, would result in those affordability improvements that the market signals uplift seeks to achieve.
It's a red herring if it's applied to the demographically derived OAN. Some, as I understand it, suggest that it ought to be applied to the economically derived figure, in which case it wouldn't be a red herring anymore, or simply academic.
But I think firstly, guidance is quite clear that it's that starting point that you apply it to. And as noted with the economic growth projection, that has already built in improvements to household formation. Part of it is addressing future declines, but actually it builds in improvements because we're going back to some of those more positive 2008 rates. And it's also building in an increase to migration. And the point was made that the increase in migration is just about bringing more workers in. It's not, the way you're looking at the migration is looking at a typical migration profile to and from York. So the additional homes that you're modelling will, under that migration schedule, be bringing in households who are of working age, as well as other households who, some people, some retirees, some other households that aren't working. So it's not simply saying, we need another 200 people of work age, therefore the population projection will just be increased by 200 people in employment. There will be those people plus their associated children, whether in families, spouses who may or may not be working, other households who won't be in employment. So I think I would stand by that if you were to, by the time you've already uplifted what to my mind in population terms at least is a very reasonable starting point for, you've uplifted that for population growth and for household formation, which are seen as the things to be easing affordability to provide access to housing. It would clearly be a further double count, as well as being contrary to guidance.
I'm looking around and I'm slightly puzzled by the number of nameplates appended. I'm reasonably sure I did ask if there was anything else on this point before I went to the council, didn't I? Correct me if I've got that wrong. Pardon?
Can I check a point, please?
Yes. Are these, sorry, Mr. Natcris and others in the corner over here, is there a particular reason why you haven't said what you wanted to say already? I thought I gave you that opportunity. See, what I don't want to do is constantly go back and forth playing ping pong across the table, because we'll be here until Christmas.
It was actually just a quick new point, sir, because you'd also mentioned the fact that it would be academic, but obviously if it was decided that the 2014 projections were relevant, then it wouldn't necessarily be academic, because then the percentage of that uplift would. So that was just the point that I wanted to make. It was nothing on the other points.
Okay, I understand what you say. Go on then, Mr. Clark.
I just want to check. We're dealing with 2.3F on the uplift on affordable housing, and that under 2.6 we will be dealing with.
No, no, I haven't come to 2.3F yet.
So, okay.
There's a nuance here. That's the difference between an uplift for affordability and the question of affordable housing, which they're different things. Are you indicating, Mr. Robinson?
I am sorry, very quickly, because you raised the point it was a red herring if we just applied the uplift to the demographic projections.
Well, I'm not sure that I raised it, but anyway, go on.
Okay, well, it was raised over there. Well, fair enough. Just the point is, the PPG says, what is the starting point to establish the need for housing? And paragraph 15 of that PPG says, well, okay, you take the household projections, and then that might require adjustment to reflect factors such as household formation rates, which are not captured in past trends. That's still under the banner of what is the starting point to establish the need for housing. Then after that, it goes and says, well, what do we do to that starting point? Do we do the market signals adjustment? So it's clear to me that the spirit of the PPG is saying you take the household projections, are they correct? If they're not, you make the adjustment, which, to be fair to GL Hearn, they've done that, and have uplifted it from 484 to 679 with their past return to trend in Table 6. They should have applied the market signals uplift to the 679, otherwise it's completely pointless doing the exercise. And that's set out in the PPG, and clearly the spirit is there in the PPG. Now, if they're going to say, well, that's not precisely how it's worded in that paragraph where it says, well, it's only the House of Projections, then, if we are being pedantic, then it says the House of Projections are the CLG ones, which are the 2014 House of Projections, not 2016. Thank you.
That confuses methodology with the fact that CLG stopped producing housing projections and left it to ONS. The point is entirely different, and that is just sophistry, I'm afraid. The policy and the methodology is clear. The source of the information has changed, as we all know.
Yeah, I'm sure that I've heard everything that I need to now about the 15% and the uplift. Which brings me then, at an alarmingly rapid rate, to question, all the way to question 2.3F. Does the revised OAN figure, the 790, take account of all housing needs, including the need for affordable housing and any need that may be the consequence of any shortfall in housing delivery before the plan period? I look to the council in the first instance.
But shall I deal with affordable housing firstly?
Yes, please go for it, Mr. Gardner.
You've got two parts, haven't you? You've got the shortfall in housing delivery before the plan period as well. In terms of affordable housing, I think we'd say yes, that certainly does meet all housing needs. In terms of affordable housing, the latest assessment was carried out by G.L. Hearn as part of the 2016 SHMA, I believe, which clearly identified a high level of affordable housing need, and the conclusions of that report being very much that the council should seek to maximise delivery of affordable housing where opportunities arise.
Just to be clear, what this question is getting at is, yes, okay, so we've got an uplift for affordability, and the question is whether there also ought to be an uplift in relation to respond to the need to provide affordable housing. That's ultimately what the question's about, really.
Okay. Well, in terms of affordable housing is quite a complex thing. It's not all about additional delivery. If you look at the affordable housing modelling, there's quite a lot of households who are existing households. So if they move home, they free up another dwelling for use by another household. A big component of the affordable need is newly forming households who are already captured within demographic projections. And with the uplifts proposed taking us from 484 to 790 dwellings per annum, it would be expected with the council's affordable housing policy that would deliver quite a substantial additional amount of affordable housing, such that the 790 figure would meet all needs, including needs for affordable housing.
So just so I'm absolutely clear, I think what you just said is that in your view, the 790 DPA would ensure that all need for affordable housing would be met. Is that right? Did I hear correctly?
Well, in terms of all need, the previous analysis suggested a need for 573 affordable homes a year, but as noted, that's not all about new dwellings because a lot of those households already live in homes. So I think what we're suggesting is that the uplift to 790 dwellings per annum will provide a reasonable additional contribution towards affordable housing.
Apologies, I don't follow that.
Well, yes, that's it. But well, I suppose what we're trying to say is there's not a mechanical link between the need for affordable housing and overall OAN. It is, in terms of planning practice guidance, it's a consideration, Quite clearly, if we look at the affordable needs, most of the households that are picked up as affordable need in that modelling are already captured within demographic projections or already have accommodation. So you've got newly forming households and existing households being the main components of that modelling. So the question is should the council consider providing more homes so they can deliver more affordable housing on the back of market schemes? I think what we're suggesting is, well, if your sort of baseline need is only for 484 dwellings per annum, but you're actually seeking to provide 790, then that's an additional 300 homes that will provide additional affordable housing and help to meet an affordable need. I don't think there's not a direct link between affordable need and OAN. It is a matter of consideration as per guidance as to what you do, and I think our view is that the uplifts are pretty substantial, and therefore that is making a significant contribution.
I think what I'm going to do is park the affordable housing issue, because actually I think it sits better under question 2.6, which I'm rather hopeful we will actually get onto today. I think what you're telling me is that in relation to OAN there ought not be an uplift in relation to affordable housing. What question 2.6 says, as you'll see, is whether or not the housing requirement will ensure that the need for affordable housing will be met, which is a slightly different thing, and I think actually the question sits better there. So I'm going to leave that for now, and we'll come on to that hopefully shortly.
Which leaves us with shortfall under F.
Yes, it does, yes.
Okay, so if I can just talk on shortfall, which in our MIQs is also covered under 2.5D, but I'll talk about it now. In line with the PPG paragraph ID 2A015, the council has assessed net housing completions over the period 2012 to 2017 and then calculated any undersupply against the OAN of 790 dwellings per annum. And this analysis shows that overall there was a shortfall of 518 dwellings across that time period using the council's net housing completion figures as in our annual monitoring reports, which of course we said we would add the clarification table to the examination library earlier today. That means that in consequence we've sought to increase the housing requirement by 32 dwellings per annum to a figure of 822 over the plan period from 2017 to 2033, which means that there's a requirement to find sufficient land to provide for 13,152 dwellings, which is 822 times the 16 years, which was indicated on the housing trajectory in the post-modifications 20 and 21 in EXCYC 20 and...
What document's that?
The proposed modifications document EXCYC 20, and the specific reference was proposed modification 20 and 21, and it was also contained within the updated figure 6 housing trajectory, which was EXCYC 16.
Just to be sure that I've understood that correctly, I think what you were saying is that you are proposing, an increase to the housing requirement. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
To make up for a past shortfall.
To make up for the shortfall in the period 2012 to 2017.
And why 2012 to 2017?
Because 2012 was the date of the demographic projections that were looked at in the housing needs work, and we were assessing whether there had been a shortfall against that 790 in that period to make sure that the plan dealt with any undersupply in that period and increased the housing requirement accordingly.
Right, so is that to say then, let me just check that the OAN update covers that period from 2012, identifies the OAN of 790 from 2012, and you've looked at that figure, looked at what's been delivered, identified that there's been a shortfall, and so added that through a proposed mod to the plan requirement. Is that, have I got that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Hurrah. Yeah, I look around the table and I see some nameplates upended, which is fine. It goes without saying that, you know, if you think that the OAN is different, then the shortfall figure is different. I simply don't need to hear that. Mr. Waters.
Thank you, Inspector. Councillor Waters, Osborwick and Derwent Ward, which will be quite severely impacted should this local plan be carried forward as it stands. I do apologise for this. I think you've jumped on a little far for me. I wanted to actually speak 2.3E, and it was regards robust methodology. Greatest respect to the process and all the participants. I'd just like to ask if anybody remembers the old columnist Keith Waterhouse, who always used to refer in his column to the National Guesswork Authority. Now, as regards the ONS figures, I seem to recall that they are within plus or minus 2.5% accuracy. It's when these figures get translated down to City of York Council level that they get rather altered. And they get altered not because of objectively assessed criteria, because of purely political criteria. I don't know, Inspector, whether you managed to see a copy of the local paper last week. There was quite a good summary of this process starting, and it actually refers to this political football over the last 20 years. I don't know whether you've seen this. If not, I'll pass it to you later. But that was definitely something that I wanted to refer to today. And I wanted to use one particularly egregious example of this process in York. And that goes back to 2011, when we was on the old local development framework. The beginning of 2011, the LDF core strategy draft, submission draft, was ready. That had a figure of 575 houses. That was readily, or I say reasonably, accepted by the York public because there was a minimal greenbelt land take. This was prepared by the Liberal Democrat Council, went forward to the Lib Dem Council on the 7th of April.
Frankly, I don't care what political persuasion that the council was of at that time, and I don't want to go anywhere near anything that sounds party political.
In the current climate, I fully appreciate that.
I simply can't, and I simply can't allow it.
575 dwellings was accepted, approved by full council, and then immediately torn up 2 months later, and then we arrived at a figure of 800. The point I'm trying to make here is 575 went through all the proper due process. The same council officers that's involved today were quite content with that. Figures can be made to mean anything. I could write the figure 1 on a piece of paper and say that it's relatively high compared with the figure 0, or relatively low compared with the figure 2. Probably the best way to sum this process up is that you are being asked to knock a square peg in a round hole if we are going to accept, and you're going to carry forward, that York is a small historic city whose setting is defined by the rural hinterland around it that frames the Minster. 790 dwellings a year will destroy that. It doesn't matter how many houses you build, people will come. 2/3 or 3/4 of everything that's proposed in this plan is purely to meet international inward migration into this city. We're shipping in cheap labour, and then we're scratching our heads as to where we house them. Surely the 650 uplift, economic uplift, needs to be looked at. And I appreciate these comments probably don't go down too well with a table that's staffed as it is now, because people have other interests. My interest lies in the fact that I've lived in York all my life, and I do not wish to see it further compromised. Thank you, Inspector.
Thank you. Mr. Corsia.
Thank you, sir. Obviously, I want to deal with the inherited shortfall here, just on that matter. What we're being proposed is the plan to add a further 32 dwellings per annum over the planned period, which is equivalent to 512 dwellings. That's, of course, equivalent to several strategic sites. And that inherited shortfall is arising, we're told, arises from the period 2012 to 2017. First question, and that has been based upon the housing needs update, which for some reason or other, it has been backdated to 2012, despite the fact that we have a plan period of 2017 to 2033, and we are now into 2019. And we're using, and is based upon 2016 base projections. It seems a strange decision in the first place. But in any event, the actual number of completions over 2012 to 2017, 3432, is more than the highest estimate of demographic need suggested by G.L. Hearn of 69, I think it's, I can't read my writing here, I think it's 629 dwellings, even using the uplifted HRRs. So the point I'm coming to, sir, is that it's not there to meet any demographic need arising from the 2016 base projections. And then, of course, well, it is there to match the 790 dwelling figure. But of course, we know that is an employment-led figure. And here we're again, one of the problems we have with the council's database is all the reports have cover different periods. And the 650 job figure, the 790 matches, of course, has a base date of 2014, not 2012. On that basis, there could be no basis whatsoever to backdate to 2012. But so again, the 650 jobs per annum.
Yeah, forgive me, Mr. Corsia. Yeah, I was slightly distracted by a frog in my throat, and I didn't quite catch what you said then about something about base date of 2014. I didn't quite hear you.
The Employment Land Review, sir. The Employment Land Review figure is a projection from 2014 to 2031. Therefore, there is no possible evidential basis to produce a OAN back to 2012, sir, of 790. And of course, moving that forward, the 650 jobs per annum is a policy target, sir. And which comes from policy SS1, and that covers a period from 2017. not 2012, or not even 2014. Insofar as there may have been jobs created in excess of any demographic requirement, that workforce would have already been catered for by either the existing housing stock or by in commuting. So we see no basis whatsoever for an inherited shortfall going back to 2012. And as I said, there's certainly no evidential basis for it for the 2012-2014 period. And there's no policy basis for it from 2017. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a short adjournment now. It is 3:30. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 3:45. Thank you.